Hey guys, tonight we take a slow stroll into the world of ancient Egypt, but not through towering pyramids or golden treasures. Instead, we're following a slightly stickier trail: beer. Yes, that humble, foamy drink you might be nursing right now actually has roots stretching back thousands of years to the banks of the Nile. Picture yourself stepping into an ancient brewery, the sweet smell of fermenting grains hanging in the warm air, a place where every sip was woven into daily rituals, sacred offerings, and even survival. And trust me, you probably won't survive a day as a beer brewing laborer back then. It was sticky, messy, and often downright puzzling. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's always fun to see where in the world we're all drifting off together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're stepping into a world where beer wasn't just a drink, it was practically a way of life. The earliest evidence of beer brewing in Egypt dates back to around 4000 BCE, long before the age of pharaohs and their grand tombs. In those dusty, sun-baked villages along the Nile, people figured out that soaking and fermenting barley grains produced a thick, nutritious liquid that was both filling and surprisingly tasty. This wasn't the crisp, bubbly lager you find at your local pub. It was more like a porridge you could drink, slightly sour and thick with sediment, served in clay cups. Historians still argue whether beer in these early times was primarily a food source or a social lubricant, but most agree it was probably both. Imagine the Nile's fertile floodplains where barley grew in abundance, becoming the backbone of this ancient brewery's supply chain. Barley was so essential that it doubled as currency, and beer was often used to pay workers who built those legendary pyramids. So, in a way, beer helped build the wonders of the ancient world. Interestingly, the earliest beer recipes weren't written in neat scripts, but passed down orally and through practice. Some archaeologists suggest that ancient brewers might have stumbled upon fermentation accidentally when damp grain cakes left out in the heat began to bubble and fizz. That accidental fizz would change human history forever, though you might want to leave those experiments to the professionals. Trust me, kitchen chemistry can get messy. As you relax into this gentle story, imagine the clinking of simple clay jars, the warm Nile breeze, and the soft chatter of workers enjoying a communal sip after a long day. That's the true heartbeat of ancient Egyptian beer culture. Humble, shared, and somehow sacred. You're still wandering through that ancient Nile village, surrounded by the dusty fields where barley first began its transformation from a humble crop to liquid gold. Barley, the backbone of Egyptian beer, was everywhere, its slender stalks swaying gently in the breeze, waiting to be harvested for the next brew. You might be surprised to learn that this grain, so ordinary today, was a superstar in the ancient world, prized not only for making bread but as the key ingredient for beer. Without barley, the daily rituals and social gatherings of Egypt's people would be far less spirited, literally. The process started in the fields, where farmers carefully tended barley crops along the Nile's floodplains. The fertile soil and predictable flooding cycles made Egypt an agricultural marvel. But growing barley wasn't as easy as it sounds. You had to time the planting just right, and when the barley ripened, harvesting was a careful dance to avoid spoiling the grains. Once harvested, the barley kernels were threshed, beaten to separate the edible part from the chaff, and then dried. Drying was crucial because moisture was the enemy of storage. Wet grains could rot or sprout prematurely, spoiling the brew. Then came the malting. This step involved soaking the barley in water to encourage sprouting. Yes, those tiny green shoots you see when you let grains sit too long. This malting process activated enzymes inside the grain that would later convert starches into sugars during brewing, which yeast could then ferment into alcohol. After sprouting, the grains were dried again to stop the growth, preserving the enzymes but preventing the barley from becoming a salad. Historians still argue whether ancient Egyptians used controlled drying methods like kilns or just left the malted barley to dry naturally in the sun. But either way, this step was vital to making beer. Once malted, the barley was ground or crushed into a coarse mash. Here's a quirky detail. Ancient brewers probably didn't have fancy mills like we do today. Instead, they used simple stone tools, or even their feet to crush the grains. A bit like stomping grapes for wine, but with more gritty crunch. This mash was then mixed with water and left to ferment, often in large clay jars. Yeast, likely coming from the natural environment, airborne or on the grain itself, started the slow work of turning sugars into alcohol. You might imagine this fermentation as a quiet, calm process, but ancient brewers had to be part scientist, part artist. Temperature mattered a lot. Too hot, and the yeast would die. Too cold, and nothing would happen. Brewing probably happened in the cooler parts of the day or in shaded areas near the Nile. Some brewers might have added herbs or dates for flavor, but barley's natural taste was the star. One fringe theory even suggests that Egyptian beer sometimes included bread-like cakes that started fermentation even before brewing, a sort of proto-sourdough starter, if you will. And speaking of starters, beer in ancient Egypt was a far cry from the filtered, carbonated beers you're used to. It was thick, murky, and often poured with the grain sediment still floating around. So each sip was a texture adventure. Workers and nobles alike drank it with straws made from reeds to avoid swallowing too much sediment, a handy invention considering. Barley's role in Egyptian society extended beyond just brewing. It was a symbol of fertility and rebirth, linked to the cycles of the Nile and the sun god Ra. You'll find barley motifs in temple carvings and tomb paintings, sometimes alongside beer jars, underscoring how intertwined this grain and drink were with both daily life and spirituality. This connection even influenced burial practices. Some pharaohs were buried with jars of beer for their journey into the afterlife, a testament to its value. Historians still debate whether beer originated independently in Egypt or was influenced by neighboring cultures like Mesopotamia, where barley beer was also common. The similarities are striking, but the exact story is murky, like the beer itself. Some suggest trade routes brought brewing knowledge southwards, while others argue that fermenting grains was a natural discovery, likely made in multiple places independently. Imagine now a day in the life of a common worker, maybe building one of those pyramids you've heard so much about. After a morning of hauling heavy stones and sweat dripping into your eyes, a cup of freshly brewed beer might be your reward. It was nutritious, hydrating, and provided a gentle buzz to soothe tired muscles. Unlike today's calorie-counting craze, this beer was calorie-rich and packed with vitamins, making it a perfect energy source. You might say it was the ancient version of a protein shake, but with more character and less plastic. So barley was not just a crop. It was a cornerstone of the ancient Egyptian economy, diet, and culture, weaving its way through everything from sacred ceremonies to everyday meals. Its transformation from grain to beer was a delicate, almost magical process that combined agriculture, chemistry, and tradition in equal parts. As you imagine the barley fields waving under a hot sun, think of how this simple grain connected the lives of farmers, brewers, workers, priests, and kings, one stalk at a time, one mug at a time. You keep strolling deeper into the ancient brewery's warm, fragrant atmosphere, surrounded by large clay pots and jars that smell faintly of sweet malt and wild yeast. These vessels were the brewing tools of choice. And if you were an ancient Egyptian brewer, or as they called them, a habinu, you'd know these containers like the back of your hand. Imagine the subtle variations in size and shape, each designed for a different step in the brewing process, from soaking grains to fermenting the thick mash into that nourishing beer. It's like a dance, a well-choreographed series of steps performed every day, carried out by hands that have learned the craft over generations. Clay was the material of choice because it was abundant along the Nile and perfect for controlling the brewing environment. When fired just right, clay pots could keep the mash at a consistent temperature and protect it from contaminants. You might find it oddly comforting that even thousands of years ago, people understood the importance of vessel design for their beloved beer. Talk about early brew tech. Some pots even had narrow necks to prevent flies and dust from ruining the precious brew, an ancient version of a lid, or what you might call a beer helmet in today's language. Historians still argue whether fermentation happened primarily in sealed pots or open vats. Some archaeological digs have uncovered large, open fermenting basins, while others found narrow-necked jars sealed with mud or resin. Both methods probably coexisted, depending on the scale and purpose of the brew. Maybe the open vats were for communal batches, where neighbors could gather and share stories while their beer bubbled away, and the sealed jars were reserved for temple offerings or elite households. One of the quirky aspects of these brewing pots is the residue left behind, which modern chemists can analyze today to understand ancient brewing techniques. These beer stains contain chemical fingerprints of barley, wheat, herbs, and even honey. Sometimes brewers added dates, spices, or aromatic plants like coriander to enhance flavor. You can almost smell the mingling scents of malt, earth, and a hint of something sweet or floral wafting through the warm air. Interestingly, some brewing pots show signs of reuse: scratches, cracks repaired with resin, or multiple layers of beer residue. It's a reminder that these tools weren't disposable. They were cherished items, carefully maintained and passed down. It makes you think of how, even in a culture as monumental as ancient Egypt, everyday objects like clay pots carried stories and history, quietly supporting life's small pleasures. Now, imagine yourself sitting near a bustling brewery, the hum of conversations, the clinking of pots, and the steady bubbling of fermentation creating a soothing symphony. Nearby, women, often the master brewers, tend to the pots, stirring mash or preparing fresh barley. Speaking of women, it's fascinating that brewing was predominantly their domain. The term beer wife was sometimes used to describe these skilled craftswomen who controlled production and even managed the family economy. You might smile at the idea that while the pharaohs were off building monuments, the beer wives were quietly running a crucial part of society. The smell of fermenting barley and bread was so common in Egyptian homes that it became part of the sensory fabric of daily life. Some historians even speculate that the aroma was so pervasive it influenced religious rituals, as the scent was associated with nourishment and divine blessing. You could say the smell of beer was the incense of the common folk. Another curious detail is the way these pots often bear decorations. Simple incised lines or patterns, sometimes even painted motifs. These might identify the brewer, the contents, or be purely ornamental. It's a small but charming reminder that even in the humblest of vessels, art and identity found a place. And speaking of art, let your mind wander to the temple reliefs and tomb paintings where these pots are immortalized in vibrant color. Scenes show workers lifting huge jars, priests offering beer to gods, and families gathered for celebrations. Each image captures the importance of brewing tools as more than just vessels. They were symbols of life, sustenance, and community. Historians still debate how standardized these brewing tools were across Egypt. Did every village have similar pots? Or did styles and sizes vary widely? It's a topic that reminds us how localized brewing could be, shaped by regional resources and traditions. The pots found near the Nile Delta might look quite different from those in Upper Egypt or desert oases. So as you imagine holding one of these clay pots, warm from fermentation, you're connecting with a practice that balanced art, science, and daily survival. These vessels, humble yet vital, carried the flavors, smells, and stories of an ancient civilization, one sip at a time. You're still nestled within the gentle bustle of that ancient Egyptian brewery, where the air hums softly with the sacred purpose behind every batch of beer. Brewing in Egypt wasn't just about making a drink, it was a ritual, a bridge between the earthly and divine. You can almost hear the murmurs of priests chanting as they prepare beer offerings to the gods, anointing the thick amber liquid with reverence before it is poured at temple altars. The connection between beer and spirituality is so deeply rooted that the Egyptians considered it a gift from the gods themselves, most notably from Osiris, the god of fertility, agriculture, and the afterlife. Beer was often brewed and offered in temples as a way to honor these gods and seek their favor. You might imagine the flickering torchlight casting soft shadows over altars piled with jars of beer, honey, and bread, as priests performed ceremonies that felt both solemn and celebratory. These offerings weren't just symbolic, they were believed to nourish the gods, keeping cosmic order intact. Even the pharaoh, seen as a divine intermediary, was expected to participate in these rituals, sipping sacred beer during festivals and religious events. Historians still argue whether the role of beer in religious ceremonies was purely symbolic, or if it also had practical ritual uses, like inducing mild intoxication to aid trance or communication with the divine. Either way, beer's presence in sacred spaces shows how important it was beyond mere sustenance. The sacredness of beer is reflected in the words and imagery found in ancient Egyptian texts and tomb paintings. The famous hymn to Osiris mentions beer as a precious gift, and hieroglyphs often depict beer jars next to offerings of bread and fruit, emphasizing the trio's spiritual and physical importance. You might picture the scene: a priest carefully pouring beer from a large jar into smaller vessels, each drop a blessing, each sip a prayer. It wasn't just about gods either. Funerary practices often included beer as part of the provisions for the afterlife. The Egyptians believed the dead would need nourishment on their journey beyond, and beer, with its nourishing qualities, was a staple in these provisions. Some tombs even contained ceramic vessels with traces of beer, suggesting the importance of this drink in life after death. The ritual use of beer extended into communal ceremonies too. Festivals dedicated to deities like Hathor, the goddess of joy and celebration, often featured abundant beer flowing freely among participants. These events were both religious and social, blending reverence with joy. Imagine yourself at one of these gatherings. The warmth of the desert night, the laughter of people sharing beer, the rhythmic beat of drums, and the flickering of oil lamps. It's a sensory world where beer lubricates not just throats but community bonds. Now, a quirky but lesser-known tidbit. Some scholars believe that the foamy head of the beer was considered especially sacred, perhaps representing the breath or spirit of the gods infused into the drink. This bubbly foam might have been carefully preserved or even ceremonially blown upon to activate the beer's divine power. Whether fact or folklore, it adds a charming layer of mystique to the brewing process. And speaking of foam, the foam itself was no accident. It was a natural byproduct of fermentation, and brewers had to master the delicate balance of temperature, grain quality, and timing to keep it just right. Too little foam, and the beer was flat. too much, and it overflowed clay pots and spilled precious brew. Managing foam was probably a task as nerve-wracking as balancing a latte's froth on a modern espresso machine. The role of beer in temple life also underscores how brewing was not merely a domestic affair, but a highly organized, sometimes large-scale operation. Temples often had dedicated breweries, staffed by skilled workers and supervised by priests, ensuring that the beer met both religious standards and the temple's nutritional needs. Beer production was integrated into temple economies, with barley fields, storage facilities, and distribution networks all controlled under temple auspices. Historians still debate whether the temple breweries functioned independently, or if they supplied beer to the general population as well. Some evidence suggests temple brews were special batches reserved for sacred use, while everyday beer came from household or village brewers. Either way, beer's dual role in sacred and secular life highlights its unique place in Egyptian culture. You can almost hear the soft chant of temple hymns, the ritual clinking of jars, and the hushed footsteps of priests carrying their sacred load through sunlit courtyards. In this world, beer is more than a drink. It is a conduit to the divine, a sacred thread weaving together gods, rulers, and common folk. And as you settle deeper into this story, imagine the quiet reverence and the gentle humor of ancient brewers who knew their craft was both an art and a prayer. Brewing was their way of honoring the Nile's bounty and keeping the spirit of Egypt flowing, one foamy cup at a time. You remain immersed in the fragrant, sun-warmed world of the ancient Egyptian brewery, but now you turn your attention to the women who made it all happen. The skilled craftswomen who brewed beer were central to Egyptian life, often overlooked today, but absolutely indispensable then. Picture a small courtyard where groups of women, some young, some elderly, gather around large clay vats, their hands expertly mixing, pouring, and tasting. Brewing was almost exclusively a female domain, a tradition rooted in both practicality and cultural roles. You might smile at the idea of these beer wives or breweresses running what was essentially a home-based industry. They juggled brewing with other household duties, but their reputation as master brewers was well known in their communities. Some women even took on the title of henner, which roughly translates to chief brewer, managing brewing on a larger scale for temples or royal estates. Their knowledge was passed down through generations, sometimes kept as closely guarded family secrets, especially the finer points that turned a good brew into a great one. Interestingly, the link between women and beer in Egypt was so strong that the word for beer in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs often incorporated symbols associated with women or goddesses. Brewing was more than a job. It was a rite of passage, a creative outlet, and a form of social currency for many women. Some scholars speculate that the social aspect of beer-making gatherings was as important as the brewing itself. Women bonded, shared stories, and exchanged recipes while their brews fermented. You might imagine the aromas mingling with laughter, the occasional teasing as someone tastes a batch that's a little too sour or a little too sweet. Brewing required a delicate balance of ingredients, timing, and temperature, and the women had an intuitive sense for these details honed by years of practice. A dash too much water or a few hours too long fermenting could mean the difference between a prized batch and a disappointing one. Historians still argue about how brewing knowledge was transmitted, whether primarily through formal apprenticeships, family lineages, or communal sharing. But what's clear is that women held not only the practical skills, but a kind of brewing authority and respect. In a culture often dominated by male figures in the historical record, these brewers quietly wielded considerable influence. Beer brewing also connected women to the sacred. Some goddesses, like Hathor and Tenenet, were associated with brewing, fertility, and joy. There are even depictions of goddesses pouring beer, reinforcing the idea that brewing was a divine craft linked to life-giving forces. You can almost hear the hushed prayers that accompanied the brewing process, asking for good health, abundance, and happiness. Now for a quirky twist. There's an ancient Egyptian love poem that compares the laughter of a beloved woman to the bubbling of freshly brewed beer. It's a reminder that beer was woven not just into work and ritual, but into art, love, and everyday life's joys. So, the next time you hear someone say cheers, you might picture a flirtatious smile and the clink of clay jars in a sunlit courtyard millennia ago. Beyond social and spiritual roles, women brewers contributed economically to their families and communities. Some sold their beer at local markets, creating a small business that supplemented household income. In some cases, temple breweries employed women as official brewers, giving them a stable role within the larger economy. This economic independence was unusual for women in many ancient cultures, highlighting Egypt's relatively progressive stance in this area. The techniques these women developed laid the groundwork for brewing traditions that would last for centuries. You can imagine a proud breweress explaining her methods to an apprentice, teaching her how to select the best barley, control fermentation, and judge the beer's readiness by taste and aroma. A craft that relied on experience and a keen sensory palate rather than written instructions. Historians still debate how formalized the brewing profession was for women. Was it a respected trade with guild-like structures, or mostly a domestic craft? Evidence points to both possibilities, depending on the era and location within Egypt. What remains undeniable is that women were the heart and soul of brewing. Imagine the soothing rhythm of daily tasks, soaking grains, stirring mashes, ladling thick beer into jars, all performed under the watchful eyes of women who knew every nuance of the craft. It's a picture of continuity and care, of a tradition where the warmth of community and the sweetness of barley came together in every batch. So, as you settle deeper into this story, picture the faces of these women, their hands stained with malt, their smiles bright as they share a first taste of a successful brew. They were the unsung architects of Egypt's beer culture, one foamy cup at a time. You're drifting further into the daily rhythms of ancient Egypt, now focusing on two staples forever intertwined: beer and bread. These weren't just side-by-side foods, they were co-stars in the Egyptian diet and culture, deeply connected in a way that would surprise most modern snackers. Imagine a humble kitchen where the smell of baking bread mingles with the sweet, earthy scent of fermenting barley. A sensory duet that echoed through homes and temples alike. Bread was the base of the Egyptian diet, made mostly from emmer wheat or barley flour. It came in many shapes and sizes, from simple flatbreads to thicker, more filling loaves. But here's a twist. Bread was also an essential part of beer production. The Egyptians used unleavened bread as a fermenting agent. Pieces of baked dough would be crumbled into the mash to kickstart fermentation. You can picture these coarse breadcrumbs swirling in thick liquid, their starches breaking down into sugars that yeast would feast on, creating bubbles and alcohol. It's like the ancient equivalent of adding sourdough starter to your morning pancake batter, but with a buzz. The relationship between bread and beer was so close that the Egyptians sometimes called beer liquid bread. This wasn't just a poetic nickname. It reflects how nutritious beer was considered, almost a meal in itself. Thick and slightly sour, it provided calories, vitamins, and hydration, often safer to drink than water from the Nile, which could be laden with parasites. Think of beer as both a drink and a survival tool, especially in Egypt's hot, dry climate. Historians still debate how much beer and bread were consumed daily by different classes. While workers and farmers probably lived on a steady diet of both, The nobility might have had more refined versions. But in households large and small, these two staples formed the backbone of meals, often accompanied by vegetables, fish, or occasionally meat. Even children drank a diluted version of beer, sometimes called small beer, to stay nourished. The baking and brewing processes often overlapped in the same household, meaning kitchens were busy, lively places filled with the sounds of pounding grain, kneading dough, and the gentle bubbling of fermentation. Women were the multitaskers here, juggling bread making and brewing, sometimes simultaneously. It's easy to imagine the rhythmic thud of mortars grinding grain echoing alongside the clink of pottery jars. One quirky tidbit about bread is that some loaves were baked in shapes resembling animals or gods, adding a playful or sacred element to what we'd now consider just food. You might picture a small, crumbly loaf shaped like a scarab beetle, a symbol of rebirth and protection. These shaped breads might have been used in religious offerings or as treats during festivals, reinforcing the sacred role of food in daily life. Bread was also often used as a form of payment. Workers, especially those building the pyramids, were partially compensated with bread and beer rations. It was a system that guaranteed a steady supply of nutrition, combining practicality with a sense of communal responsibility. Imagine queuing up after a hard day's work to receive your share of bread and beer, a reward as eagerly anticipated as a paycheck today. The close pairing of bread and beer extended beyond nutrition into symbolism and religion. Both were offered to gods and ancestors, placed in tombs to sustain spirits in the afterlife. In this sense, bread and beer were sacred gifts, representing life's essentials and the generosity of the gods. Historians still argue about whether the fermentation of bread and beer developed together or separately, but evidence suggests a shared origin. The interplay of baking and brewing reflects the ingenuity of ancient Egyptians, turning simple ingredients into multiple nourishing products. This dual use of grain might explain why barley and wheat were so highly prized and carefully cultivated. You can almost smell the warm ovens and hear the crackle of fires where bread's baked in clay molds or on heated stones. The kitchen, a hub of sensory delight, was where survival met celebration, where daily bread fed bodies and beer lifted spirits. As you imagine the bustling kitchen life, picture children eagerly nibbling fresh bread while their parents pour thick beer into small clay cups. It's a scene of comforting routine and shared nourishment, a gentle reminder that even in ancient times, food was about connection, care, and community. So, as you relax into this story, think of bread and beer not just as ancient foods, but as enduring symbols of life's simple pleasures, baked and brewed with love, shared in good company, and savored with quiet gratitude. You find yourself moving through the daily life of ancient Egyptians, now seated at a communal table where the rich, earthy aroma of freshly brewed beer fills the air. Beer was more than just a drink. It was a social glue that brought people together from all walks of life, workers, nobles, and even pharaohs alike. Imagine a bustling village square or a shaded courtyard where conversations flow as freely as the thick, slightly sour liquid poured into clay cups. Here, beer was both a refreshment and a ritual, shaping moments large and small. For the average worker, beer was an essential part of the diet. After long hours under the hot Egyptian sun, a frothy cup of beer was both nourishing and hydrating. Unlike modern soft drinks or plain water, which could be contaminated, beer was considered a safer option, thanks to the fermentation process killing off harmful microbes. Think of it as an ancient energy drink, complete with vitamins and calories to fuel backbreaking labor. You might chuckle at the idea that some workers' wages were actually paid in beer rations. Yes, the people who built the pyramids were rewarded not just with coins, but with daily servings of beer. This tradition made beer a symbol of work, rest, and community all at once. After all, who wouldn't look forward to that after a day of hauling limestone blocks? Nobles and officials had a somewhat different beer experience. Their brews were often more refined, sometimes flavored with dates, herbs, or honey to create sweeter, more complex tastes. Pharaohs themselves weren't above enjoying a good cup of beer, and some records suggest elaborate banquets where beer flowed alongside wine and exotic dishes. Picture a royal feast, the air thick with music, laughter, and the clinking of goblets filled with the finest brews Egypt had to offer. Historians still debate how much of this beer culture was shared across classes and how strictly beer was divided socially. While nobles might have sipped more delicate versions, common folks' beer was hearty and unfiltered, a robust drink that matched their rugged lifestyles. But one thing is clear: beer was universal, crossing social boundaries and binding Egyptians together in daily rituals. The social nature of beer extended beyond work and banquets. Festivals and religious ceremonies featured communal drinking, often accompanied by music, dance, and storytelling. Imagine a nighttime festival under a starry sky where villagers gather around fires, passing around shared vessels of beer, singing hymns to Hathor or Osiris, and celebrating life's cycles. These moments turned beer into more than a beverage. It became a connector, a mood enhancer, and a cultural centerpiece. Here's a quirky detail. Ancient Egyptians sometimes used straws made from hollow reeds to sip beer. This wasn't just to avoid the gritty sediment floating in the thick brew, but might have been a social statement, like using a fancy straw today. It's an image worth picturing. Groups of friends, each with a slender reed, sipping together as stories and jokes flow, the laughter echoing softly in the warm evening air. The communal aspect also extended to the sharing of beer at family meals. It wasn't unusual for everyone at the table, from toddlers drinking diluted versions to elders savoring the stronger stuff, to partake together. Beer cups were often passed around, encouraging conversation and connection. This sharing was a subtle but powerful ritual of bonding and mutual care. Beer also played a role in hospitality. Offering beer to guests was a sign of welcome and generosity. Refusing beer could be seen as impolite or even insulting. So you might imagine that many social invitations included the promise of good beer and good company, a timeless combination that still resonates today. Historians still argue about the precise rituals around communal drinking. Were there set toasts, prayers, or rules about who drank first? The evidence is sparse, but the importance of beer as a social lubricant is unmistakable. It was woven into the fabric of Egyptian life, from mundane meals to extraordinary ceremonies. As you imagine this scene, the clinking of clay cups, the soft hum of conversation, the warm Nile breeze, you're connecting with a timeless human experience, the joy of sharing a drink with others. Beer in ancient Egypt was less about intoxication and more about nourishment, social cohesion, and ritual. So, as you settle into this story, picture yourself surrounded by friends and neighbors, the air thick with laughter and the comforting scent of barley and honey. You raise your reed straw in a silent toast to the enduring power of community and connection, one foamy sip at a time. You're now drifting gently into a quieter corner of ancient Egyptian life, where the lines between medicine and daily routine blur softly, like mist over the Nile at dawn. Beer, you see, wasn't just a social lubricant or a sacred offering. It was also a common remedy, a liquid medicine trusted by doctors, priests, and households alike. Imagine a humble healer's workshop or a bustling marketplace where herbalists prepare concoctions, often blending beer with herbs and spices to soothe ailments or boost vitality. In the Egyptian medical texts, beer is mentioned as a key ingredient in various remedies. Its fermentation process produced compounds believed to have antiseptic qualities, and its rich nutrients could help restore strength to the weak or ill. For example, doctors recommended beer for digestive issues, infections, and even as a disinfectant for wounds. The idea was that the beer's natural yeast and alcohol content could cleanse the body gently and promote healing. You might smile at the idea that beer was used to treat headaches and stomach pains. Imagine ancient Egyptians sipping a frothy cup instead of popping pills. Some recipes even called for adding herbs like coriander, juniper, or myrrh to enhance the medicinal effects and mask the sometimes bitter taste of the brew. This combination of alcohol and herbs is surprisingly familiar, a precursor to modern tinctures and herbal liqueurs. Interestingly, beer was also used as a prenatal tonic for expectant mothers, believed to provide essential nutrients and keep both mother and child healthy. This might sound strange now, but it highlights how deeply integrated beer was into the cycle of life, from birth to death and everything in between. Historians still argue how much of beer's medicinal reputation was based on actual healing properties versus cultural belief or ritual. But the evidence suggests that even if it wasn't a cure-all, beer's nutritional and antiseptic qualities gave it a practical place in ancient Egyptian healthcare. A quirky tidbit to ponder. Some scholars suggest that ancient brewers added ingredients like crocodile dung or fermented fish entrails to their beer, both to enhance flavor and perhaps for supposed health benefits. While this sounds utterly bizarre and definitely not recommended today, it reflects the experimental nature of early brewing and medicine. Thankfully, these additives were not the norm, and more often, soothing herbs took center stage. You can almost hear the soft voice of a healer explaining to a worried family how a warm cup of herbal beer might ease fever or calm the stomach. The trust placed in beer as a medicine speaks to its versatility and the intimate relationship Egyptians had with their brews. Beer also played a role in hygiene and sanitation. The antiseptic properties of alcohol meant that beer was sometimes used to clean wounds or as a mild disinfectant, especially in places where clean water was scarce. Imagine a farmer rinsing a scrape with beer rather than plain water, which might harbor unseen bacteria. Historians still debate whether beer's role in health was more symbolic or practical. Some believe that the beer drinking culture indirectly improved health by providing safer hydration and calories, while others argue for a more direct medicinal impact. Either way, beer's presence in medical texts and daily life shows how multifaceted it was. This connection between beer and health was reinforced by its spiritual significance. Healing gods like Thoth and Sekhmet were often invoked during brewing rituals, linking the physical process of fermentation with divine power to restore balance and vitality. The act of brewing itself could be a kind of prayer, a way to channel life-giving forces into the liquid. As you relax into this story, imagine the soothing warmth of a clay cup filled with foamy, aromatic beer mixed with fragrant herbs. The gentle bitterness and sweet undertones mingle on your tongue as you feel a calm spreading through your body. A simple remedy from a world long past, yet still strangely comforting. So, as you settle deeper into this tale, think of beer not just as a drink or a ritual, but as an ancient medicine, a potion brewed with care and hope, connecting body and spirit in a gentle embrace, one nourishing sip at a time. You drift deeper now into the complex and flavorful world of ancient Egyptian beer, where each batch told a different story, through variations in flavor, ingredients, and brewing techniques. The diversity of brews was as rich as the culture itself, ranging from simple, everyday drinks to more exotic and ceremonial concoctions. Imagine a bustling marketplace with stalls displaying pots of beer, each with its own aroma, color, and texture, some sweetened with dates, others spiced with herbs, and a few even tinged with mysterious flavors lost to time. The core ingredient remained barley, But brewers experimented with additional grains like emmer wheat or millet, tweaking recipes to suit local tastes and available resources. Some beers were lighter and more refreshing, intended for hot afternoons under the blazing sun, while others were thick and nourishing, designed to sustain workers through grueling days. Historians still debate the precise ingredients and proportions used in these ancient recipes. Some scholars argue that flavorings like honey, cinnamon, or juniper were common, while others suggest such additives were rare and reserved for special occasions. This uncertainty leaves room for imagination. Maybe a subtle hint of lavender here, or a whisper of cardamom there, wafting through the air as villagers gathered to share a communal drink. A quirky detail that often surprises modern listeners is the occasional use of non-traditional ingredients, like the addition of flower petals or even bits of fruit peel to enhance aroma and taste. Some archaeological evidence hints at brews infused with chamomile or hibiscus, lending a floral softness to the otherwise earthy base. Imagine a gentle, fragrant beer sipped slowly beneath a shaded palm grove. The debate over original recipes also touches on brewing methods. Did brewers use open fermentation vats exposed to wild yeast, or did they cultivate specific yeast strains for consistency? While we can't be sure, it's likely that both methods existed, with some brewers relying on nature's whims and others carefully nurturing their cultures. Much like today's craft brewers balancing tradition and innovation, flavor was not the only variation. Color and texture also differed widely. The traditional Egyptian beer was thick and cloudy, a far cry from today's clear, carbonated ales. Sediment-rich and nutritious, it required straws to avoid swallowing the grain husks. You might picture groups of friends sharing from a large communal jar, each sipping through slender reeds as laughter and stories fill the warm evening air. Historians still argue whether these variations were regional, temporal, or social. That is, did Upper Egypt favor different styles than the Nile Delta? Did royal brews differ substantially from those of commoners? The evidence suggests a lively and evolving brewing culture where recipes adapted to occasion, location, and consumer preferences. Brewing also responded to seasons and crop yields. During abundant years, brewers could afford to experiment and create richer, more flavorful batches. In lean times, beer might be thinner, more diluted, or reserved for special events. The ebb and flow of the Nile, with its floods and droughts, dictated much of this rhythm. You might imagine the brewer carefully tasting each batch, balancing sweetness, bitterness, and aroma, a task requiring experience and intuition. This was a craft passed down through families, especially among women, who guarded their recipes like precious heirlooms. Another charming detail: ancient brewers sometimes wrote brief notes or marked pots to distinguish batches, possibly indicating ingredients or intended use. Though few written records survive, these small gestures hint at a sophisticated brewing culture where quality and identity mattered. Imagine yourself wandering through a village festival, where different brews compete for favor. Some villagers swear by a honeyed, spiced variety, while others prefer the earthy, robust, traditional brew. The friendly debates, the clinking of cups, and the shared enjoyment highlight how beer was both a personal preference and a cultural tradition. As you sink into this scene, think of the incredible diversity behind what might seem a simple drink. Each batch, each sip carried layers of flavor, history, and human touch, crafted to nourish, to please, and to bring people together. So as you settle more deeply into this story, savor the thought of ancient Egyptian beers as vibrant, evolving expressions of a civilization's creativity and connection, one richly brewed cup at a time. You're easing now into the dusty construction camps scattered across ancient Egypt, where the mighty pyramids and temples were slowly carved from stone, and where beer played a surprisingly pivotal role. Imagine the sweltering sun beating down on the backs of laborers, the air thick with dust and sweat, and at the end of the day, the cooling relief of a foamy cup of beer waiting for them. Beer wasn't just a treat. It was an essential fuel that powered these monumental construction projects, binding communities and supporting incredible feats of engineering. Workers consumed vast quantities of beer daily, sometimes as much as 4 to 5 liters each. This wasn't because they were partying after work, but because beer provided necessary calories, hydration, and a gentle buzz to soothe aches and exhaustion. Far from the notion that beer slows you down, in ancient Egypt, it was a performance enhancer, a practical, delicious way to survive grueling labor. The logistics of supplying these workers with beer were complex. Temples and royal estates often controlled the breweries that supplied the workforce. Archaeologists have uncovered records showing precise rations of barley and beer allotted to laborers, indicating an organized and well-managed system. Imagine overseers carefully distributing cups of beer at regular intervals, ensuring morale and strength remained high. Historians still debate the exact scale and methods of this provisioning system. Some suggest the beer was brewed on site at the construction camps, while others argue it was transported from centralized breweries. Either way, the coordination required reflects a society deeply aware of beer's importance, not just as a beverage, but as a vital resource. Interestingly, beer was sometimes used as a form of payment. Workers might receive rations of beer alongside bread and other staples as compensation for their labor. This system reinforced the social contract between rulers and workers, with beer symbolizing both sustenance and reward. You can picture the anticipation of the end-of-day beer serving, a moment of communal relief and connection. Beyond its nutritional value, beer also played a role in fostering camaraderie and cooperation among workers. Shared beer breaks became moments to rest, share stories, and build social bonds, crucial elements in maintaining the workforce's stability. Imagine clusters of men gathered under makeshift shade, the air filled with laughter and the clink of pottery cups. The workers' beer wasn't the refined, clear brew of nobles, but a thick, hearty version full of sediment and grain, often consumed through reed straws. It was nourishing and practical, not concerned with aesthetics. The rough texture and robust flavor matched the toughness of the laborers themselves. Historians still argue about how much beer contributed to the success of these projects. While it undoubtedly helped sustain workers, some question whether the quantities consumed might have caused issues like intoxication or health problems. But evidence leans toward beer being a controlled, respected resource rather than a source of chaos. Imagine yourself as one of these workers, tired but satisfied, raising a mug of cool beer to your lips after a long day hauling stones. The bittersweet liquid revives you, and the shared ritual brings a sense of belonging and accomplishment. Beer here is not just refreshment, it's a symbol of endurance, cooperation, and human ingenuity. The importance of beer extended beyond just the laborers. Supervisors, architects, and priests involved in construction also consumed beer, often in more refined forms, marking the different social strata while maintaining a shared cultural thread. Banquets celebrating construction milestones included beer as a key element, reinforcing its role in both work and celebration. You might find it amusing to think that beer, a drink many today enjoy casually, was once a cornerstone of engineering marvels. Without it, the pyramids and temples might never have risen from the desert sands, or at least not with the same scale and speed. As you relax into this narrative, picture the steady rhythm of the construction site, the clang of tools, the shuffle of feet, and the soothing, frothy reward of beer at day's end. It's a story of survival, community, and the quiet power of a drink brewed thousands of years ago. So as you settle deeper into this story, savor the idea that beer was not just a simple beverage but a vital force behind some of humanity's greatest architectural achievements, one nourishing cup at a time. You drift gently now into the festive heart of ancient Egypt, where beer flowed freely amid celebrations that mixed joy, reverence, and community spirit. Imagine yourself under a sprawling date palm, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows as the village gathers for a festival honoring Hathor, the goddess of music, dance, and pleasure. Here, beer is more than a drink. It's the lifeblood of the party, weaving together laughter, music, and sacred ceremony in a warm golden glow. Festivals in ancient Egypt were grand affairs that marked seasons, religious occasions, and agricultural cycles. Beer played a starring role, both as an offering to the gods and as a social lubricant for the crowds. Envision priests carrying large decorated jars of beer to temple altars, their movements deliberate and respectful. The beer, often thick and foamy, was poured as libations to ensure divine favor and abundant harvests. The communal aspect of these celebrations cannot be overstated. Villagers, nobles, and priests alike shared beer from common vessels, toasting gods and ancestors with heartfelt chants and songs. The shared drinking created a sense of unity and belonging, dissolving social barriers for a night under the stars. Imagine the rhythmic beat of drums, the swaying of dancers, and the gentle buzz of a well-lubricated crowd moving as one. Historians still debate the extent to which beer was consumed in moderation or revelry during festivals. Some suggest controlled rituals with sacred portions, while others imagine lively feasts where merriment sometimes ran late into the night. Either way, the evidence paints a picture of beer as a social cornerstone, fueling not just the body, but the spirit. The flavors of festival beers were often enhanced with special ingredients. Dates, honey, and aromatic herbs were added to create richer, sweeter brews, setting them apart from the everyday working man's beer. These special batches were reserved for religious ceremonies and high-status guests, adding an air of exclusivity and celebration. Imagine sipping a cup of this golden nectar, its sweetness balanced by earthy malt and fragrant spices. A quirky detail that survives in some festival scenes is the use of music and dance as part of the beer experience. Musicians played instruments like harps, flutes, and percussion, while dancers moved gracefully or wildly, depending on the occasion. Beer may have softened inhibitions, encouraging freer expression and joyful abandon, a reminder that the ancients knew how to celebrate well. Beer also featured in rites of passage during festivals, marking moments of transition such as marriage, childbirth, and funerals. In these solemn yet hopeful gatherings, beer offered comfort, connection, and a shared ritual language. It's touching to imagine families raising their cups together, toasting the cycles of life with love and reverence. Historians still argue about how gender roles influenced festival drinking. While men predominantly appear in temple scenes and public ceremonies, women likely participated in more private or community-oriented celebrations. The presence of beer wives as brewers and distributors suggests women played crucial roles in ensuring that beer reached the right hands at the right time. Imagine the sensory richness of a festival evening, the scent of roasted meats, the glow of oil lamps, the taste of sweet, spiced beer mingling with the cool night air, the laughter of children, the deep voices of elders telling stories, and the delicate clinking of reed straws as friends share their drinks. Beer's role in these festivals was more than indulgence. It was a sacred act, a communal prayer, and a joyous affirmation of life's abundance. It embodied the connection between earth and sky, the gods and humans, and between neighbors who shared in the daily miracles of existence. As you settle deeper into this story, picture the glow of a fire casting dancing shadows on joyous faces, the warmth of shared drink flowing through the crowd like a gentle current. Here, beer is the thread stitching together moments of celebration, gratitude, and community, one bubbling cup at a time. So, as you ease further into this narrative, let the festival's rhythms lull you into calm, imagining the ancient cheers, songs, and the sweet taste of celebration long past but never forgotten. You are now entering the realm of legend and myth, where the origins of beer mingle with the tales told around flickering fires, whispered in temple halls, and painted on the walls of tombs. Imagine yourself sitting cross-legged among a circle of storytellers, their faces glowing with torchlight as they recount how beer came to be, a gift from the gods, a magical brew discovered by chance or divine intervention. These stories are as thick with mystery as the beer itself, weaving history and imagination into a comforting tapestry. One of the most famous legends centers on Osiris, the god of fertility, death, and resurrection. It is said that Osiris taught humanity the secrets of agriculture and brewing, blessing the people with barley and the knowledge to turn it into nourishing beer. In some versions, beer was a sacred elixir, capable of connecting mortals with the divine, a bridge between worlds. You might imagine priests invoking Osiris during brewing rituals, asking for his blessing to ensure a successful fermentation and a beer worthy of the gods. Another popular myth involves the goddess Hathor, often called the mistress of drunkenness, who was believed to oversee joy, music, and intoxication. According to legend, she taught humans the art of brewing to bring happiness and relieve suffering. However, her power was double-edged. Beer could bring joy but also reckless abandon. The myths caution moderation, reminding drinkers that the gods' gifts must be respected. Historians still debate how these myths influenced actual brewing practices and whether they evolved alongside the craft or emerged later as symbolic stories. It's possible that as brewing became integral to daily and religious life, these divine tales developed to explain and sanctify the process, lending it greater meaning. A quirky piece of folklore tells of the accidental discovery of beer when a baker's bread left out too long began to ferment. The bubbly, sour liquid that resulted was first tasted by chance and soon celebrated as a heavenly gift. You can picture the startled but delighted expression of the first taster, surprised by the strange but pleasant sensation of this new drink. It's a story reminiscent of other origin myths, highlighting how everyday mishaps can lead to life-changing discoveries. These myths also touch on beer's role in festivals and celebrations. For example, during the ancient Festival of Drunkenness, participants would honor Hathor by drinking beer and embracing joyful madness, believed to bring spiritual purification and renewal. The festival's rituals were a way to temporarily loosen the strictures of society and invite divine ecstasy into human lives. Beer's mythical origins extend to its symbolic representation in Egyptian art. Jars of beer often appear alongside depictions of gods, sacred animals, and offerings, emphasizing its status as a divine substance. Some tomb paintings even show deceased individuals enjoying beer in the afterlife, ensuring their eternal happiness. Historians still argue about how much of these myths were part of everyday belief versus temple propaganda. It's likely that while priests emphasized the sacred aspects, common people embraced beer's role in both life's pleasures and spiritual practices. The layering of myth and reality created a rich cultural texture that elevated beer beyond a mere beverage. Imagine yourself sipping a cup of thick, foamy beer as you listen to these stories, each gulp a connection to gods and ancestors, each taste a sip of history and mystery. The myths wrap around the senses, filling the room with a sense of wonder and timelessness. So, as you drift further into this tale, let the legends lull you into calm, their gentle voices weaving through your thoughts like the soft bubbling of fermentation. Beer, you realize, is not just a drink, but a story ancient, sacred, and ever-flowing, one mythical cup at a time. You now find yourself in the hot, arid landscape of ancient Egypt, where keeping beer fresh and drinkable was a daily challenge, especially when the sun beat down mercilessly and dust swirled in the dry air. Imagine yourself in a cool, shaded storage room carved from mud brick, where rows of clay jars stand silently, sealed with mud or resin to protect their precious contents. This was the secret to ancient Egypt's brewing success. Not just making beer, but mastering the art of storage and preservation. The climate of Egypt posed unique problems for beer storage. Without refrigeration or modern preservatives, beer was prone to spoilage from heat, light, and contamination. Brewers developed ingenious methods to keep their brews fresh and safe to drink. Sealing jars tightly with mud, resin, or cloth was one such method, creating an almost airtight environment that slowed fermentation and kept unwanted particles out. You might picture workers carefully applying layers of resin to the mouths of jars, their hands sticky with the fragrant pitch-like substance. Historians still debate how standardized these sealing techniques were across regions. Some pottery shards show evidence of sophisticated sealing compounds, while others suggest more rudimentary coverings, indicating local variations in technology and resources. This diversity reflects the adaptability of brewers to their environment and circumstances. The shape and size of storage vessels also played a role in preservation. Large, narrow-necked jars minimized exposure to air and contaminants, while smaller pots allowed for easier portion control. Some jars had handles or spouts, making pouring more manageable and reducing the risk of spills and exposure. It's easy to imagine these practical details making a big difference in the quality and longevity of beer. One curious detail is that some breweries stored beer underground or in cool cellars, using the Earth's natural insulation to combat the desert heat. These subterranean spaces would have been dark, quiet refuges from the sun, where the cool air slowed fermentation and preserved flavors. Imagine stepping into one of these cool rooms, the air thick with the scent of malt and yeast, a welcome contrast to the blazing heat outside. Dust and sand were constant threats. Brewers often covered open vats with palm leaves or reed mats to shield their beer from airborne debris. This simple solution protected the beer while allowing some airflow, essential for fermentation. The interplay of air and darkness was a delicate balance requiring careful attention and experience. Historians still argue about how often beer went bad or spoiled despite these precautions. Archaeological evidence shows residue of fermented beverages, but also hints at occasional contamination or over-fermentation. Some brewers may have consumed slightly sour or off beer without complaint, as tastes and expectations differed from modern palates. Storage wasn't just about keeping beer drinkable. It was also about timing. Brewers needed to know when the beer had reached its peak and when to distribute or consume it before quality declined. This required a trained palate and keen observation. Imagine a brewer sampling from a clay jar, noting the aroma, taste, and texture to decide if the beer was ready. The economic importance of beer storage also cannot be overstated. Temples, royal estates, and large households kept stockpiles to ensure a steady supply for workers, rituals, and feasts. Running out of beer could mean unrest or spiritual imbalance, so managing storage was a critical task. You can almost hear the soft clink of jars being moved, the careful sealing of lids, and the quiet conversations about which batches are freshest. These moments of quiet care reflect a sophisticated understanding of preservation and quality control. As you settle deeper into the story, imagine the cool shade of storage rooms, the reassuring weight of clay pots filled with life-giving beer, and the watchful eyes of brewers guarding their precious cargo. It's a story of patience, craft, and survival, one carefully sealed jar at a time. So as you drift further into this tale, let the calmness of these hidden spaces soothe you, the quiet guardians of beer's legacy in a world of sun and sand. You now step into the bustling marketplaces and tax offices of ancient Egypt, where beer was not just a beloved beverage, but also a key player in the economy, and surprisingly, a significant source of revenue for the state. Imagine a sun-dappled courtyard filled with merchants, brewers, scribes, and tax collectors, each busy with their own roles in this complex system centered around barley and beer. Beer was so important that it was often taxed, and those taxes helped fund everything from temple construction to military campaigns. The government regulated the production and sale of beer, keeping close tabs on brewers and merchants. You might picture scribes with their reed pens, meticulously recording quantities of barley and beer, calculating dues owed to the state. These tax records demonstrate how deeply integrated beer was in Egypt's administrative machinery. Historians still debate the precise methods of beer taxation, whether it was a flat rate on production, a levy on sales, or a combination of both. Some evidence suggests that brewers were taxed in barley rather than finished beer, emphasizing the importance of grain as both currency and raw material. Others propose that beer taverns and vendors paid fees for the right to sell their wares. The diversity of taxation hints at a complex system that evolved over time and varied by region. The economic role of beer extended beyond taxation. Large-scale breweries were often state-run or temple-owned, producing beer in quantities sufficient to supply workers, priests, and the population at large. This scale of production required careful management of resources, fields of barley, water supplies, labor, and ensured a steady flow of beer into the marketplace. You might find it fascinating that beer was used as a form of payment in the workforce. Laborers, especially those involved in monumental projects like pyramid building, often received daily rations of beer. This practice tied the economy, nutrition, and social order together, reinforcing beer's role as a staple commodity. A quirky, yet telling detail is that tax records sometimes listed beer in fractions of jars or cups, highlighting the precise accounting that ancient Egyptian bureaucracy practiced. Imagine a tax collector poring over scrolls, balancing accounts with meticulous care, all centered around a beverage that today we often take for granted. Marketplaces themselves were lively centers of social and economic activity. Vendors sold beer alongside bread, vegetables, and crafts, calling out to passers-by in the humid air. The smell of fermenting barley mixed with spices and smoke from nearby cooking fires, creating an atmosphere thick with sensory delights. Historians still argue about the extent to which private brewers could operate independently versus being controlled by the state or temples. Some believe small household breweries thrived alongside large state-run operations, catering to local demand and personal consumption. Others suggest heavy state intervention limited private enterprise. Either way, the economic importance of beer cannot be overstated. Beer's role in commerce also extended to trade beyond Egypt's borders. Barley and beer were commodities exchanged along the Nile and with neighboring regions, carrying Egyptian culture and economic influence. Imagine caravans laden with jars of beer and sacks of barley, traversing deserts and riverways as symbols of wealth and connection. The interplay of beer, taxation, and economy highlights the sophistication of ancient Egyptian society. This was a civilization that understood the power of a good brew, not just to nourish but to organize and sustain. As you settle into this narrative, picture the sharp eyes of tax collectors, the bustling chatter of market sellers, and the steady flow of beer shaping life and livelihood. Beer here is currency, culture, and community all at once, one carefully counted cup at a time. So, as you drift further into this story, Let the rhythms of commerce and calculation soothe you, a gentle reminder of how deeply beer was woven into the fabric of ancient Egyptian life. You drift now beyond the borders of ancient Egypt, following the ancient trade routes that linked this great civilization to its neighbors. Nubia to the south, the bustling city-states of Mesopotamia to the northeast, and the lands beyond the deserts and seas. Imagine yourself walking alongside caravans laden with goods, jars of beer included, traveling vast distances under a blazing sun, crossing rugged terrain, and passing through bustling border markets. Here, beer was not just an Egyptian treasure. It became a thread woven into a broader tapestry of cross-cultural exchange. Trade routes like the Nile Corridor and desert paths connected Egypt to Nubia, whose own brewing traditions intertwined with Egyptian methods. Nubian brewers crafted their versions of beer, sometimes using millet instead of barley, creating unique flavors that fascinated Egyptian travelers. You might imagine these border markets filled with the mingled aromas of diverse brews, spices, and grains, a sensory feast for travelers and traders alike. Historians still debate how much brewing knowledge and beer itself were shared along these routes. Some evidence suggests that techniques and ingredients traveled with merchants, adapting to local climates and tastes. Others argue that similar fermenting practices arose independently in neighboring cultures, driven by the universal human discovery of fermentation. Either way, the trade networks created a lively dialogue of brewing ideas and flavors. Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, had its own rich beer culture, with recipes and brewing methods recorded on cuneiform tablets. There, beer was deeply embedded in religious life and daily sustenance, much like in Egypt. Imagine the cultural exchanges between scribes and brewers who traveled or corresponded, sharing insights that helped refine brewing techniques across regions. One quirky detail is that some Mesopotamian beer recipes included dates and spices similar to those found in Egyptian brews, hinting at shared tastes or common origins. This culinary cross-pollination is a fascinating glimpse into ancient globalization. The famed silk routes and other later trade paths extended these exchanges further, carrying barley, beer-making knowledge, and even specific strains of yeast across continents. Egypt's brewing tradition thus became part of a wider ancient conversation, influencing and being influenced by distant cultures. Historians still argue about the extent of Egypt's influence on other brewing traditions, and whether Egyptian beer itself was exported widely or primarily consumed domestically. Archaeological finds of Egyptian-style beer jars in Nubian sites suggest some degree of export or imitation, but the full story remains tantalizingly incomplete. Trade wasn't just about goods, but also about ideas and rituals. Beer's sacred role in Egypt may have inspired neighboring cultures to develop similar spiritual connections to their brews. Imagine priests from different lands exchanging stories about gods of brewing and drinking, weaving mythologies that reflected shared human values. The economic importance of beer also tied into political relations. Gifts of beer accompanied diplomatic missions, symbolizing goodwill and alliance. The offering of such a fundamental and cherished commodity underscored the trust and respect between rulers. As you imagine this journey along ancient trade routes, picture the diverse faces of merchants and travelers, the clinking of jars packed carefully for the trip, and the excitement of sharing familiar tastes in foreign lands. Beer here is a connector, a passport of flavor and friendship. So, as you relax into this story, savor the idea that ancient Egyptian beer was more than a local delight. It was part of a grand exchange that shaped cultures, economies, and relationships across continents, one traveling jar at a time. You're now invited to a quiet Egyptian home where the rituals surrounding the drinking of beer reveal as much about manners and community as about the drink itself. Imagine a warm, clay-walled room with sunlight filtering through woven mats, soft chatter filling the space, and the gentle clinking of clay cups being passed around. Beer drinking was a social act, governed by etiquette and tradition, a dance of cups, reeds, and respect that bound families and friends together. At the table, drinking vessels varied, from large communal jars to smaller personal cups, each suited for a particular role. Imagine a large jar in the center, its thick contents slowly poured into individual cups. Straws made from hollow reeds helped avoid the gritty sediment, allowing drinkers to enjoy the smoothest sips. This wasn't just practical, it was a subtle social marker. Using a straw showed you understood the intricacies of beer drinking and cared about savoring the brew properly. Historians still debate the rituals and rules around these communal drinks. Was there a set order for passing the cup? Did the eldest drink first, or did the host offer the first sip? The sparse records leave these questions open, but it's clear that the act of sharing beer was steeped in social meaning, signaling hospitality, respect, and trust. Guests arriving at an Egyptian home were often greeted with a serving of beer, a gesture of welcome and goodwill. Refusing beer could be seen as a slight, so offering and accepting beer were fundamental to social interaction. You might picture a visitor sitting on woven mats, offered a cup filled with frothy brew, and smiling in gratitude as the host's generosity flowed as freely as the beer. Beer drinking also accompanied meals, enhancing flavors and easing digestion. The slightly sour taste complemented breads, vegetables, and fish, while the alcohol gently loosened tongues and softened hierarchies. Imagine the relaxed atmosphere around the table where conversation and laughter grew as the mugs were passed, a quirky detail to ponder. In some scenes, beer cups were decorated or marked to indicate ownership or social status. A cup might bear simple carvings or painted motifs, turning a humble vessel into a symbol of identity. This personalization added a layer of intimacy and pride to the act of drinking. Drinking etiquette also extended to gender roles. While men predominantly appear in formal drinking scenes, women were central to brewing and household consumption. It's likely that private or family settings saw more mixed-gender drinking, blurring the strict lines seen in public rituals. Historians still argue about the extent to which beer drinking was ritualized versus casual. Some suggest highly formalized ceremonies, especially in temples and royal courts, while others see everyday drinking as more relaxed, embedded in the rhythms of daily life. Both views likely coexist, reflecting the rich complexity of Egyptian society. Imagine the tactile sensation of holding a cool clay cup, the weight familiar and comforting, the slightly rough texture grounding you in the moment. Each sip is a connection, not just to the beverage, but to the people sharing it with you, the traditions behind it, and the land that nurtured the barley. As you settle into this scene, feel the gentle flow of conversation, the shared smiles, and the warmth of community. Beer here is not just a drink, but a language, a bridge between people and moments. So, as you drift deeper into this story, let the clinking of cups and the soft murmur of voices lull you into calm, savoring the timeless intimacy of shared drink, one delicate sip at a time. You're now stepping into the more curious and sometimes surprising side of ancient Egyptian brewing, the quirky additives and rituals that might make a modern brewer raise an eyebrow. Imagine yourself peering into a bustling brewery courtyard, where alongside the golden barley and water, more unexpected ingredients are added to the mix, each bringing unique flavors, properties, or symbolic meanings. One of the most famous and peculiar tidbits involves the use of crocodile dung, not as a flavoring but as a kind of sunscreen or medicinal additive during brewing. While it sounds utterly bizarre and definitely unappetizing by today's standards, some historical accounts and recent studies suggest that bits of crocodile dung might have been used in the brewing vessels or applied externally by workers to protect their skin from the harsh desert sun. This strange practice reflects the Egyptians' resourcefulness and their close relationship with the Nile's wildlife, blending practical needs with symbolic associations. Historians still argue about the prevalence and exact purpose of crocodile dung in brewing or skincare. Was it a common additive, a regional quirk, or simply a misunderstood practice? The evidence is fragmentary, leaving room for lively debate and a touch of mystery. Beyond crocodile dung, brewers often experimented with various herbs and spices. Honey was a popular sweetener, adding depth and a smooth finish to the earthy barley flavors. Imagine the faint scent of honey mingling with malt as brewers stirred their vats, creating a brew that was both nourishing and delightfully fragrant. Other herbs included coriander, juniper berries, and even resin from trees, which may have served as natural preservatives or flavor enhancers. These botanical additions not only varied the taste but also carried symbolic or medicinal meanings, linking beer to the wider world of healing and magic. You might chuckle at the idea that some brewers tossed flower petals or fruit peels into their vats, creating floral or citrusy notes. While such ingredients would surprise most modern beer drinkers, they highlight the ancient Egyptians' desire to tailor flavors and experiences, much like today's craft brewers who experiment with hops and spices. Another quirky detail is the occasional use of fermented fish entrails or other unusual organic matter. This practice, again, is debated among scholars, but suggests that ancient brewers were willing to explore bold flavors and textures, perhaps influenced by local traditions or the availability of ingredients. The presence of these additives reminds us that brewing was not just a science, but also an art and a cultural expression. Brewers balanced taste, aroma, preservation, and symbolic significance, crafting beers that nourished both body and soul. Historians still argue how much these additives affected the flavor and quality of the beer. Were some considered delicacies, while others were pragmatic or ritualistic? The lack of written recipes leaves much to the imagination, but the archaeological and textual hints paint a picture of vibrant experimentation. Imagine the sensory experience, the heady mix of malt, honey, herbs, and the faintly wild tang of ancient waters. It's a brew rich with history, culture, and a pinch of daring creativity. As you settle deeper into the story, picture the brewer's hands carefully selecting ingredients, the mixing of scents, and the bubbling anticipation of a new batch. Brewing was a living tradition, constantly evolving and adapting, embracing both the familiar and the unexpected. So, as you drift further into this tale, let the strange and wonderful flavors of ancient Egyptian beer inspire your imagination, reminding you that even in a world so long past, the spirit of experimentation and joy in craft lived on, one curious sip at a time. You're now walking among the dusty ruins and silent tombs, where fragments of ancient pottery whisper stories of brewing long past. Archaeological digs have unearthed countless shards of clay jars and cups, each piece a silent testament to the craft and culture of beer in ancient Egypt. Imagine the careful hands of archaeologists brushing dirt away from a broken vessel, revealing traces of residue that, with modern science, unlock secrets of centuries-old recipes and rituals. These pottery shards are more than just broken bits of clay. They are time capsules containing chemical clues. Scientists analyze the residue for barley proteins, yeast cells, and even traces of flavoring agents like honey or herbs. Each find adds a brushstroke to the picture of ancient brewing practices, showing variations in ingredients, methods, and even the social status of the beer's consumers. Historians still debate the interpretations of these chemical signatures. Were some jars used exclusively for temple offerings, filled with the finest brews, while others held everyday beer for workers? The evidence suggests a complex landscape where beer quality and purpose varied widely. A quirky insight from these archaeological finds is the discovery of the brewery waste, discarded grain husks, and broken pots near ancient brewery sites. This waste shows signs of repeated use and repair, indicating a cycle of brewing, consumption, and recycling deeply embedded in daily life. Imagine the rhythmic pounding of grain, the careful stirring of mash, and the reverent handling of precious pots, all part of a centuries-old tradition. Pottery styles themselves vary widely. Some jars are simple and utilitarian, while others are elaborately decorated with inscriptions or painted scenes. These artistic touches hint at the pride and cultural significance brewers placed on their craft. In temple tombs, jars bearing the names of gods or pharaohs suggest beer's sacred status. Historians still argue about whether brewers used standardized containers or if styles and sizes changed by region and period. The variety found at excavation sites reflects a dynamic, evolving brewing culture, adapting to new technologies, tastes, and social needs. The size of these vessels also tells a story. Large jars could hold enough beer for communal feasts or temple rituals, while smaller pots were meant for personal consumption. Imagine a feast where massive jars are rolled in to be shared among dozens, each drinker sipping through a reed straw to avoid the thick sediment. A practical solution that also fostered intimacy and shared experience. Beyond physical vessels, some tomb paintings depict scenes of brewing and beer drinking, giving life to the dry pottery fragments. These vibrant images show brewers at work, priests making offerings, and families sharing drinks, reminding us that beer was woven into the fabric of everyday life and spiritual practice. Imagine the sensory contrast: the rough texture of pottery against smooth hands, the earthy aroma of fermented grains lingering in the air, and the soft murmur of shared stories as jars are passed. These shards connect you across millennia to brewers and drinkers long gone, their lives briefly illuminated by the simple act of sharing beer. As you settle deeper into this story, picture the silent jars as storytellers, their worn surfaces speaking of creation, use, and reverence. Through their fragments, you glimpse the ingenuity, tradition, and human connection that defined ancient Egyptian beer culture. So as you drift further into this tale, let these broken vessels remind you that even in ruin, history endures, one cherished sip at a time. You are gently carried forward into the present, where the echoes of ancient Egyptian beer resonate with the vibrant world of modern craft brewing. Imagine stepping into a contemporary brewery, the air rich with malt and hops, where brewers experiment with recipes inspired by those early, thick, nourishing beers from the Nile Valley. This is a world where history and innovation intertwine, honoring tradition while pushing boundaries. Many modern brewers have taken inspiration from ancient Egyptian brewing techniques, experimenting with barley varieties, fermentation styles, and flavorings that echo the past. Imagine a brewmaster studying ancient texts and pottery residues, carefully selecting malt and herbs to recreate beers that would taste familiar, yet novel. These craft brews often emphasize the rich, unfiltered textures and complex aromas that defined Egyptian beer, rejecting overly processed and filtered commercial varieties. Historians still debate how accurately these modern recreations capture the original flavors and methods. With limited archaeological evidence, brewers rely on a blend of scientific analysis and educated guesswork. But the spirit of experimentation remains alive, much like the ancient brewers who balanced art and science to nourish their communities. You might find it fascinating that some breweries have introduced ingredients like honey, coriander, and dates to evoke the flavors Egyptians cherished. Others play with fermentation times to achieve the thick, porridge-like consistency described in historical accounts. Imagine sipping one of these modern, ancient-style beers, each swallow a bridge across millennia. Beyond flavor, modern craft brewers often embrace the cultural and spiritual significance of ancient brewing. Festivals celebrating Egyptian beer heritage are held worldwide, where enthusiasts gather to share stories, taste recreations, and connect with history. These events mirror the ancient festivals by fostering community and appreciation for brewing as both art and tradition. Quirky modern twists include brewing with wild yeast strains or using traditional clay vessels for fermentation and storage, seeking authenticity in both taste and process. Imagine a brewery where fermentation bubbles rise quietly in sunlit pottery jars, much like they did thousands of years ago along the Nile. The renewed interest in ancient Egyptian beer also sparks scholarly and public fascination, blending education with enjoyment. Documentaries, museum exhibits, and tastings invite people to experience history through their palates, transforming dusty archives into living memories. Historians and brewers alike continue to debate which ancient techniques translate best to today's equipment and ingredients. Questions linger about yeast strains, water sources, and brewing temperatures, variables that ancient brewers managed intuitively but modern science seeks to quantify. This ongoing dialogue enriches both fields, connecting ancient wisdom with contemporary craft. Imagine yourself at a tasting event, surrounded by curious faces, each person savoring a glass of golden liquid steeped in history. The shared appreciation creates a sense of continuity, linking your moment to those of brewers and drinkers across centuries. As you settle into this story, think of brewing as a timeless human endeavor, one that nourishes body, spirit, and community. The past and present merge in every glass raised, celebrating the enduring power of beer. So, as you drift deeper into this tale, let the flavors of ancient Egyptian beer inspire your dreams, reminding you that history is not just learned, but tasted. One carefully crafted sip at a time. You've traveled far now, from the dusty Nile floodplains to the vibrant markets and quiet homes, feeling the pulse of a civilization intertwined with the art of beer brewing. As we reach the final stretch of this journey, take a moment to reflect on the legacy of ancient Egyptian beer, a story that bubbles gently beneath history's grand monuments, nourishing the lives of millions and leaving an indelible mark on culture and craft. Beer in ancient Egypt was more than just a beverage. It was a symbol of life itself. From sacred offerings to daily sustenance, from laborers' rations to royal banquets, beer threaded through the fabric of society, a comforting constant in an ever-changing world. You might imagine that each foamy cup carried with it stories of toil and triumph, of gods and mortals, of laughter shared beneath the sun and stars. Historians continue to unravel this legacy, piecing together shards of pottery, ancient texts, and faded murals. The debates and discoveries remind us that history is alive, a conversation across time. You too are part of this dialogue now, connected through the simple yet profound act of sharing a story. Let's pause to consider the artisans behind this legacy, the women and men who mastered the craft, passing down knowledge through hands worn with care and skill. They transformed humble grains into liquid gold, infusing each batch with tradition, innovation, and spirit. Imagine their smiles as a successful brew was tasted, their quiet pride in a job well done. The cultural and spiritual significance of beer extended beyond Egypt's borders, influencing neighboring lands and centuries of brewing tradition. Its recipes and rituals have seeped into the global story of fermentation, reminding us that the thirst for community, celebration, and nourishment is universal. In the modern world where craft brewing flourishes with creativity and passion, the echoes of ancient Egyptian brewers resonate. Each experiment with heritage recipes, Each celebration of unfiltered rich beers is a tribute to those ancient hands that first unlocked the magic of fermentation. As you prepare to rest, picture the gentle Nile flowing softly under a twilight sky, the warm glow of lamps flickering in quiet homes where stories of beer and life are shared. The legacy of brewing is a gift, passed from generation to generation, a thread of connection woven through time. Now, as your eyelids grow heavy, let the soft rhythm of this story lull you to peace. Imagine the sweet taste of barley and honey mingling with the warm air, the gentle bubbling of fermentation like a heartbeat, steady and calm. Feel the comforting presence of history wrapping around you like a soft blanket. This journey through ancient Egyptian beer is more than a history lesson. It's a reminder of life's simple pleasures, the power of community, and the enduring spirit of human creativity. Let these thoughts drift with you into sleep, carrying you on waves of calm and curiosity. Rest easy now, knowing that with each breath, you're part of a long flowing story, one of barley, water, and the magic of transformation. Sweet dreams.